80,000 years ago, a supervolcano in Indonesia exploded with a force so catastrophic it nearly wiped out the human species. And every dragon you have ever seen carved into a temple wall, every dragon boat race you have ever watched, every myth about serpents rising from rivers across all of Asia traces back to that single moment. Today, we are pulling on that thread. Specifically, we are going to understand what iconographic writing actually is and why it is not art, how archaic cartography turned river geography into political constitutions, and how the rise of Asia's river kingdoms gave birth to the dragon as a symbol. By the end of this episode, you will never look at a dragon the same way again. I am joined by someone who has gone very deep into this research, and I want to start right at the beginning, because I think most people have no idea that there is a writing system hiding in plain sight across all of Asia.
So the place to start is with a claim that sounds completely outrageous until you sit with it for a moment. The royal barges of the Kingdom of Thailand, those enormous ornate ceremonial boats, are not decorative objects. They are constitutional documents. According to the research, each one is, for all intents and purposes, a deed to an archaic realm, documenting the structure and function of a kingdom. The iconography carved into their hulls is a writing system, and that writing system is based on cartography.
Wait, cartography? Like maps?
Exactly like maps. The research describes this as iconographic writing, a system that modulates visual information rather than verbal information. And the genius of a visual markup language is immediately obvious once you recognize it was used across language barriers spanning an entire continent. Every composition in this system has a container, a binder, and sets of related icons documenting the principal institutions and leadership of archaic realms. The container, the overall shape of the composition, always had to look like the realm it documented. The borders and general details were all based on cartography.
So the shape of the barge, or the shape of the creature carved into it, is literally the shape of the kingdom's geography.
That is exactly right. And the research identifies the royal barge Anantanakaraj as the founding example, the iconographic longboat commemorating the king who first reclaimed the Chao Phraya River and the realm he founded. Its design must be interpreted as the deed to an archaic realm. But to understand why the Chao Phraya matters, you have to go back to 75,000 BC and the Toba supervolcano.
Right, and this is where the story gets genuinely staggering, because the Toba eruption is not just a backdrop, it is the engine of everything that follows.
It really is. The research describes the Toba supereruption of 80,000 BC as the event that confined the ancestors of Asia's river kingdoms to the Indonesian and Philippine archipelago. And the entire subsequent history, the reclamation of Asia's rivers, the founding of kingdoms, the iconographic writing system, all of it flows directly from that catastrophe. Now, one detail that matters enormously for understanding the iconography is that ocean levels were 40 meters lower in 75,000 BC. The island of Borneo was connected to the Malaysian peninsula. Sumatra was connected too. The coastline of Asia looked completely different.
And that changes the geography of every river system we are talking about.
Dramatically. The research documents how the Chao Phraya River and the Mekong River followed a different course near the glacial maximum of 24,500 BC. The Chao Phraya was actually a tributary of the larger Mekong for a significant part of history. And here is the detail that the research calls critical. The unexpected meeting of Asian rivers at their headwaters is the key to understanding and interpreting Asian iconography and, therefore, Asian history.
So the rivers that are separated by thousands of miles at their mouths are actually within walking distance of each other up in the mountains?
Within walking distance, yes. And that geographic fact becomes the entire political architecture of the archaic world. But before we get there, why was the Chao Phraya the first river reclaimed? The research gives a very specific answer. The Chao Phraya catchment was not fed by runoff from the Tibetan Plateau. Every other major river in Southeast Asia finds its headwaters in the Himalayan mountains, and each was awash in volcanic ash and toxic fallout from the Toba eruption for decades. The Chao Phraya was able to wash its catchment free of ash and toxins long before all other rivers.
So it was the first clean river, the first viable route back.
Exactly. And the route from the Debutanti Court on the Kapuas River in Borneo to the headwaters of the Chao Phraya was over 1,600 miles as the crow flies. The research describes how new kindred courts were established at reasonable intervals all along that route, not just to make the journey possible, but to maintain it across generations. This was not a single expedition. This was a multi-generational project of reclamation.
That is a scale of organized human effort that most people would not associate with 75,000 BC.
And that is precisely the point the research is making. These were not wandering tribes. These were kingdoms with constitutions, with orders of precedence, with diplomatic protocols. And all of that is encoded in the iconography. Which brings us to Garuda, because Garuda is where the cartography becomes almost impossible to dismiss.
Okay, so Garuda, the great eagle figure from Hindu and Southeast Asian mythology, most people know it as a mythological creature. But the research is saying something very different.
The research is saying Garuda is a map. Specifically, the geology of Southeast Asia, the contours of the land between the Kong River, the Chao Phraya, and the Mekong forms the unmistakable profile of Garuda's head. And this is not a loose resemblance. The research describes how the eyes, ears, nose, and tongue of Garuda each correspond to specific political courts with specific functions. The nose is a dominant mountain, the king's residence. The eye is downstream where royal expositions were held. The ear is where the arbitrating courts convened. And the tongue is where decisions were announced.
So the anatomy of the creature is literally a map of the political system.
The anatomy is the political system. And the research points to Angkor Wat as the proof, a bust of Garuda carved into the temples there that the researcher describes as all the proof required to contribute to linguistics in a meaningful way. The geology of the region does not just support the iconography, it, quote, immaculately conforms to it.
That is a strong claim. And I imagine skeptics push back hard on this.
The research anticipates that objection directly. The response is that the eyes, ears, and nose cannot go anywhere else. The geology of each region does not just support, it conforms to the iconography. You cannot selectively place them. The geology constrains the interpretation. And once you accept that, the political implications start cascading. Because if Garuda's anatomy maps to political courts, then every other creature in the iconographic system does the same thing.
Which is where the Naga, the dragon, comes in.
Right. And this is where the research gets into the Seven Rivers realm, which is the name given to the founding political structure of Asia. The research identifies 7 major rivers, each of which founded a kingdom. Reading from left to right in the archaic orientation, the Irrawaddy, the Kong, the Chao Phraya, the Mekong, the Red River, the Pearl River, and the Yangtze. 7 rivers, 7 kingdoms.
And the number 7 is not arbitrary.
Not at all. The research is very specific about this. Every time we witness a composition of 7 elements, regardless of the culture or continent, we are witnessing a complete census of a peerage of nobility. And the reason 7 is the number is celestial, the sun, the moon, and the 5 visible planets. These were the celestial metronomes that synchronized kindred life throughout the archaic world, allowed for coordinated activity, and governed the socio-political calendar. 7 kingdoms, 7 celestial bodies. It is pure pragmatism, not mysticism.
That reframe is genuinely striking. We tend to assume 7 is a mystical number, but the research is saying it is a practical one. It is the number of things everyone could see in the sky.
Exactly. And the same logic applies to the 7 portages, the 7 crossing points between the Chao Phraya headwaters and the Mekong tributaries. The research identifies 7 specific locations: the Nan River, the Nam O River, the Nam Ta River, the Nam Khan River, the Ying River, the Lao River, and the Kok River. Each was chosen as a diplomatic meeting point for one of the 7 kingdoms. Not just the path of least resistance logistically, but chosen to deconflict a critical hub for the majority of the continent.
So these mountain passes are essentially the ancient equivalent of embassies.
That is a very good way to put it. And the research describes how kindred courts matured into dominions, dominions into kingdoms, kingdoms into realms and nations. The 4th portage, the center of the 7, was, by default, the ruling court from which the arbiter in common, the king of kings, ruled. And the royal barge Anantanakaraj documents this. The 4th and central Naga of the figurehead census is the largest, representing the arbitrating noble.
Okay, I want to pause on something here because I think this is the moment where the dragon question becomes unavoidable. Why dragons? Why not just use the actual animals of the region? Eagles, hornbills, real serpents?
So the research gives a very specific and, honestly, delightful answer to this. It starts with eels. Eels were a staple food source in the rivers of Southeast Asia, abundant, serpentine, following the same winding course as the rivers themselves. Because eels were so common and because they evoke the serpentine course of Asia's rivers, they were adopted to represent river kingdoms. That is the origin of the Naga, the dragon serpent of Asian iconography.
So the dragon is a glorified eel.
A fictional, scaled-up eel, yes. And the research explains why fiction became necessary. As populations grew, the demand for real fauna, feathers, beaks, hides, claws, for use in royal regalia began to endanger the actual species. So fictional creatures were invented. A dragon is easier to imagine, with convoluted anatomy to represent convoluted geology. As long as the creature, factual or fictional, resembled the geology surveyed, the iconographic purpose was achieved.
That is one of those explanations that makes complete sense the moment you hear it, and yet I have never heard anyone say it before.
And it has a direct implication for why dragons appear across so many cultures that seem unconnected. It is not because of some shared mystical tradition. It is because the same practical logic, serpentine rivers, serpentine iconography, fictional fauna to protect real species, played out independently wherever river kingdoms formed. The research also notes that Garuda himself is a chimeric species, a humanoid eagle with no clear ancestor in the avian world. Fictional primates appear in the census too. The draconic idiom was just the most versatile.
And the research connects this to something I find genuinely fascinating. The idea that dragon boat racing, which is still practiced across Asia today, is not just a cultural tradition. It is a living memory of this archaic political system.
The research states this directly. The reason all nations in Asia maintain fleets of dragon boats and race them downriver annually is because each of Asia's major kingdoms was, at one time, a draconic realm. The race is a shared archaic memory, and the royal barge Anantanakaraj is the document identifying the elder dominion to which all Naga turned for arbitration, the Chao Phraya kingdom, not the Yangtze, not the Mekong.
Let's talk about some of the specific kingdoms, because the research goes into real detail on a few of them, and I think the stories are worth telling. The Ekachai twin barges, for instance.
So the Ekachai barges are described as twins, two identical barges, both featuring a dragon's head clutching a pearl in its mouth. The research identifies these as documenting the Red River Kingdom. And the Red River has a very specific geographic problem. It has no dominant fork anywhere along its main course. The founding patriarch would have had to travel all the way to the headwaters to find a suitable location for a royal court. That geographic constraint is why the kingdom split into two principalities.
And the pearl in the dragon's mouth, that is not decorative either.
Not at all. The research is very clear. The pearl is a map. Specifically, it documents the Isle of Hainan, which at that time was still a peninsula connected to mainland Asia. The placement of the pearl on the tongues of both Ekachai dragons alludes to the locus of authority between the two principalities. Hainan was the neutral ground, the regnal court that favored neither twin. The research describes this as the pearl of wisdom, documented in maternal iconography, pearls being emblematic of the moon, and yet the dominion itself is documented in paternal black.
And the research connects this to Sun Wukong, the Monkey King from Journey to the West.
This is one of the more striking connections in the research. The Asura figure, the arbiter of the triad formed by the Red, Pearl, and Yangtze rivers, is identified in the geology of the Yangtze headwaters as a humanoid primate figure. And the research asks directly, is this not Sun Wukong? Sun Wukong's origins, the research notes, predate the 16th century novel Journey to the West. The character was influenced by earlier Chinese folklore, Taoist and Buddhist tales, and possibly Hindu mythology through the Silk Road. The research argues that Chinese legend and Hindu legend are two chapters of the same archaic book.
That is a genuinely bold claim. Two of the world's great mythological traditions as parallel records of the same historical events.
And the research supports it with specific textual connections. Sun Wukong's magical staff, the Ruyi Jingubang, is identified as the regnal regalia documenting the course of the Red River. His miraculous birth from a stone egg that absorbed the essence of heaven and earth is identified as the Isle of Hainan. His imprisonment under a mountain is the king of the dominion being, quote, imprisoned in stone, the convolutions of the geology forming the figure. The research states, I dare you to argue that Sun Wukong is not, to this day, imprisoned in stone.
Okay, I want to take a slight detour here because there is a detail in the research that I cannot stop thinking about. The origin of the handshake.
Yes, so the research describes how, in the anthropomorphic idiom of iconography, rivers are documented as human arms and headwaters are documented as hands. And because all of Asia's major rivers converge in a narrow range of mountains near the Tibetan Plateau, separated by thousands of miles at their deltas, but within walking distance of each other at their headwaters, the research argues this is where the handshake as a courtesy originates. The convergence of hands is where the property line formed, And the Tai Wai gesture, the prayer hands greeting, is described as demonstrating courtesy throughout Asia as a whole because all the iconographic hands of Asia came together at a common source.
So every time someone shakes hands, they might be performing a gesture that is 75,000 years old and rooted in river geography.
That is the hypothesis. And the research is careful to note it is a hypothesis, but it is grounded in the same cartographic logic as everything else in the system. Where all political hands converge, peace must prevail. That, obviously, was a hope, not a guarantee.
Which brings us to the conflicts, because the research describes a period of real crisis in the Seven Rivers realm when all the kingdoms converged in their headwaters and ran out of room.
Right. The research describes a moment when all the princes of Asia found themselves bumping heads in their journey westward. Every kingdom's destiny was to reclaim promising lands, and all paths converged at the headwaters. The research frames this as an inevitable result of good intentions. The sovereign father in Borneo intended for each of his children to establish kingdoms along a major river, but those kingdoms all converged. Brothers separated by thousands of miles at their coasts found themselves in conflict in the mountains.
And the resolution of that conflict is where figures like Parashurama and Ganesha enter the story.
Exactly. The research identifies Parashurama as the just warrior who resolved the Archaic conflict, and his title, the research notes, is a composite. Parashu was the name of the prince's regalia, appended to his name Rama. From his chivalrous service forward, a standard of chivalry was set and a regnal title established. And Ganesha is identified as the prince chosen to found the Kingdom of India, his first task being to navigate down the Brahmaputra and document the coast of India, which was still ecologically devastated from the Toba eruption.
The research even connects Ganesha's famous broken tusk to this political history.
It does. In Hindu scripture, Parashurama struck Ganesha on the head, and the blow only chopped off one of Ganesha's tusks. The research identifies that tusk as the Irrawaddy River catchment, a dominion originally claimed by Ganesha and his kinsmen during the Noble Progress, which was ceded to Parashurama to ensure the peace of all. The Seven Rivers realm had to have 7 rivers. The Irrawaddy was the price of peace.
That is extraordinary. A mythological story about a broken tusk is actually a record of a land for peace deal.
And the research argues this is the consistent pattern across all archaic iconography. The myths are not allegories invented to teach moral lessons. They are encrypted historical records. The iconographic writing system was the encryption, and cartography is the key.
Let's talk about Mount Meru, because this is where the research lands on something that I think will genuinely surprise people who know Hindu cosmology.
So, Mount Meru in Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist cosmology is described as the axis mundi, the center of all physical, metaphysical, and spiritual universes, the abode of Lord Indra and various devas. The research identifies a specific physical location for Mount Meru, Kawajibo Mountain, also known as the Mali Snow Mountain, in what is now Yunnan, China, the region known today as Shangri-La.
Shangri-La, the mythical paradise.
Which, the research notes, is a real place, the Diqing Tibetan Autonomous Prefecture in Yunnan. And Kawajibo is described in regional legend as the reincarnation of a prince who transformed into a snowy peak after being struck by lightning, a protector and guardian of the region. The research identifies the 5 dominant peaks of the Meili mountain range as the 5 sacred peaks of Hindu and Chinese legend, the great capital formed between 5 great mountains. Each peak served as a regnal court for the 5 emperors appointed to serve the 3 sovereigns of Oceania.
And the central peak, number 3, is identified as Mount Meru itself.
The central mountain, yes. And the research describes this as the Holy See of Asia, not just for one tradition, but for every tradition in Asia. 7 rivers converged at the foot of Mount Meru, and every one of those kingdoms sent representatives to the royal court there. The research is very direct about the implication. Hindu scripture refers to a place which is both temporal and divine at once, the nexus where heaven and earth meet, the spiritual and temporal Greenwich of the archaic world.
And there is a specific archaeological implication here, Lake Erhai.
Lake Erhai is identified in the research as potentially the most important unexcavated archaeological site in Asia. It sits in the very headwaters of the Red River, where the archaic conflict likely began. The research describes it as the debutante court of Asia's nobility following the archaic crisis. And crucially, lake sediments are the most reliable archaeological context, far more reliable than riverine contexts, which are constantly disturbed by water flow. The research states that the sediments of Lake Erhai perfectly preserve the chronology of human occupation in the region going back, potentially, hundreds of thousands of years.
So there is a lake in Yunnan that might contain a continuous archaeological record of human civilization going back to before the Toba eruption, and it has not been fully excavated.
That is the claim. And the research frames its exploration as being in the common interests of mankind, not just one nation or one tradition, which connects to one of the more politically charged conclusions in the research, the assertion that Taiwan is the iconographic breast of Sufanahong, the phoenix of Asia, and that the iconographic record, when fully read, suggests Taiwan does not belong to China. China, in the archaic record, belongs to Taiwan.
That is going to land differently depending on who is listening.
It will. And the research acknowledges that. But the argument is grounded in the iconographic record, not in modern politics. Sufanahong, the Phoenix Barge, is identified as a coastal kingdom including the northern Philippines, Taiwan, the Canton coast of China, Korea, and Japan. Taiwan is the iconographic center of that kingdom. The research also notes that much of China's archaic literary tradition was destroyed, first by Qin Shi Huang, who burned the archives of all rivals he overthrew, and then further damaged in the 20th century. What survives, retold in works like Journey to the West, is described as fragments of a much larger archaic record.
And the Krabi, the sword-wielding warrior figures of Thai mythology, those are also mapped to specific geology.
Yes. The Krabi are identified in the headwaters of the Kong River, where the convolutions of the valley system converged with those of the Irrawaddy and Brahmaputra. The research traces the figure of the Krabi emerging from the geology of the region and identifies it as Hanuman, the faithful warrior of the Ramayana. And the research notes that Krabi and Thai legend refers to mythical and historical figures associated with bravery, strength, and martial prowess, the term Krabi itself meaning sword in Thai. In the Ramakien, the Thai version of the Ramayana, characters like Hanuman display the spirit of the Krabi. The research argues these are not separate traditions. They are the same archaic record told from different vantage points.
So when you step back from all of this, the Toba eruption, the river kingdoms, the iconographic writing system, the dragons, the myths, what is the through line? What is the thing that ties it all together?
The through line is survival and organization. A catastrophe nearly ended the human species. The survivors retreated to the islands of Indonesia and the Philippines. And then, over tens of thousands of years, they organized, they developed a writing system based on cartography, they established kindred courts at intervals across 1,600 miles of reclaimed territory, they founded kingdoms on every major river in Asia, they encoded their political constitutions into the shapes of ceremonial barges and temple carvings and mythological creatures. Every dragon, every Naga, every Garuda is a record of that process.
And the myths we inherited, Hindu cosmogony, Chinese legend, Thai epic, are not separate inventions. They are chapters of the same book.
The research puts it exactly that way. Chinese legend and Hindu legend are two chapters of the same book. Both document a diplomatic, regional conflict. Both resolve the conflict with the accession of a patriarch to a position of nobility or chivalry. The iconographic writing system was the shared language. Cartography was the shared grammar, and the rivers were the shared infrastructure, the superhighways of the archaic age.
There is something almost vertiginous about that realization. We have been reading these myths as stories about gods and monsters, and they are actually records of land for peace deals and river basin diplomacy.
And the research is careful to say the iconographic record is not finished being read. The methodology, identifying cartographic origins of iconographic compositions, can be applied to every archaic culture on every continent. The research mentions examples from Wales, from Spain, from Egypt, from Arabia. The Dama de Elche in Spain, for instance, is identified as a composition based on the cartography of the Iberian Peninsula. Egyptian hieroglyphics are described as an innovation on the same underlying system. Egypt upgraded to a phonetic script while its neighbors retained the iconographic original.
So this is not just an Asian story, it is a human story.
It is a human story, and the research frames the royal barges of Thailand as a library of narratives recounting the noble progress of mankind from an ancient disaster that nearly ended the beauty and genius replete in those stunning works. That is not a small claim, but the cartographic evidence, the research argues, is there for anyone willing to look.
Here is what this really comes down to, I think. We have spent this episode tracing a single thread from a supervolcano 80,000 years ago, through the reclamation of Asia's rivers, through the founding of 7 kingdoms, through the invention of dragons as political symbols, all the way to the myths and ceremonies that are still alive today. And the argument is that none of it is disconnected. It is all one continuous record.
And the actionable insight, if there is one, is that the tools to read that record already exist: cartography, geology, comparative mythology, archaeology. The research is essentially saying, we have been looking at these objects and these stories as art and as fantasy when they are actually data. Once you shift that frame, everything changes.
The research also raises a real-world implication that I think deserves to be said plainly. Lake Erhai in Yunnan, that potential archive of 100,000 years of human history, is sitting there, and the research argues its exploration is in the common interests of all of mankind, not just one nation.
And that connects to the broader point about what happens when archaic records are destroyed or suppressed. The research is pointed about the destruction of China's literary tradition, first under Qin Shi Huang, then in the 20th century. What archaeologists are about to discover, the research argues, is that all which was condemned as myth is the truth, and all that was advanced as the truth is a lie. That is a reckoning that goes well beyond academic debate.
And it is a reckoning that the iconographic record, once fully deciphered, will force, because you cannot argue with cartography. The geology is the geology.
That is the research's core claim. The bones of the Naga are made of the very stone of the earth. You can suppress a text. You cannot suppress a mountain range.
I love that line. You can suppress a text, you cannot suppress a mountain range.
And that is why the research is so insistent that all religious and cultural factions in Asia reconcile themselves to a common origin. Because when the cartography emerges from the dust of the ages, there will be no denying it. The 7 rivers converged. The kingdoms were real. The dragons were maps. And the myths were constitutions.
So the next time you see a dragon carved into a temple wall, or watch a dragon boat race, or, and I cannot believe I am saying this, shake someone's hand, you are touching something that is potentially 80,000 years old. You are participating in a memory that survived a supervolcano, an ice age, the rise and fall of empires, and the deliberate destruction of archives by tyrants. That is what the research is asking us to sit with.
And the research ends with an invitation, not a conclusion. There is so much more to tell. The narratives of Izanagi, Maui, Noah, the Arabian Iconographic Record, the Indian coast, the Mesopotamian river. The iconographic writing system was global. The decipherment has only just begun.
That is a genuinely open ending, and I think it is the right one, because the honest answer to most of the biggest questions here is archaeology will have to determine the order. The methodology is there, the cartography is there, the work is ahead of us.
And the research is explicit that it is not married to any particular interpretation. The goal is to identify the methods by which our ancestors encrypted cartographical data and historical narratives in iconographic compositions, so that we may now correctly interpret them. The interpretations will be refined. The method, the research argues, is sound.
We started this episode with a supervolcano that nearly ended everything, and we are ending with the realization that the people who survived it left us a library carved in stone, encoded in mythology, racing down rivers every year in dragon boats. We just forgot how to read it.